And we are live. My name is Joe Ragazzo. I'm here with TPM's founder, Josh Marshall. I'm TPM's publisher. And we just wanted to hop on today on a Friday and talk about the media business. There's a lot going on, as there always is in the news business. We're in the middle of a membership drive, which is obviously part of the news business. So, Josh, how you doing?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I thought we could start with a post you did, I think last week, and it was about state media and TPM, and it was on the heels of Hegseth essentially publicly, salivating and daydreaming about a day when CNN will finally be friendly when David Ellison takes over. And I think it's an important one to start with because the consolidation and the coziness with the Trump administration is a real thing, and we're seeing it in multiple avenues. So, let's talk a little bit about that, and your thoughts on this stuff, and the post, and everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been writing about, in addition to, sort of my day job, writing about politics and political culture. I've been writing about the business side of media for, I guess, since TPM started, but I think especially since like 2012, which is when we started to move into the current era. I write about it a lot. In this particular case, if I don't know how much everybody listening is familiar with this, but Larry Ellison is the Oracle guy, and he's got this sort of uh, what is it? What's the word we used to use? Large adult son or whatever guy who
Yeah.
who he's sort of gifted him into being a media mogul. They bought Paramount, and then they bought Paramount, which meant they also got CBS News, CBS News, and they just bought Time Warner, which means they got all sorts of cable channels and movie back catalog. But also means they're going to have CNN, and it's still possible this could get hung up in like state antitrust stuff, but probably not. CNN is going to be owned by this guy. So you have this, basically a private sector state media operation. What's interesting to me is that you have we have the sort of the ongoing stories of all the problems in the problems on the business side of the media business, in some ways going back to the 90s, but in a very acute way back to the late teens and the few years before the pandemic. And that has, in a new and even deeper way, overlapped with the political economy and what's happening in our politics. That Trump wants to have his friends buy up all the big media organs, and they are, and even the ones they haven't bought. What we've seen is that if most big media organizations, the ones that open, the ones that the big newspapers, the cable networks, the news divisions of the TV networks, all these kind of things, they're almost all owned by big diversified corporations. And there's lots of reasons for that. And one of the things that Trump has shown is that you simply cannot be an independent media organization if you're owned by one of those companies, even if the company itself is totally well-meaning. Because a president, when they are out of control the way that Trump is, when they're not having to follow the law, they can just exert too much. Uh, they have too many carrots and, well, too many sticks. They also have some carrots, but it's just impossible. And it's even more the case because in whether it's like a Comcast or a Paramount, any of these big companies, the news organization, the media organization, is always going to be, like, at best, a sort of a break even proposition, and that goes back forever. The cable news networks always had their news divisions as loss leaders. maybe the news division made a little money, but basically that was just a sort of a mix of public service and sort of like a prestige thing that added some prestige to the whole thing. But in itself, it lost money, right? CBS News, ABC News, NBC News, all of these forever. And so just, right now we have all of these things, a convergence of all of these different trends. You have a president who is willing to use the powers of the office uh, in a way that they can be when no one's enforcing the law, that gives him tremendous power, right? You also have the fact that none of the sort of existing platforms of the news business are really financially viable in a deep way right now. Whether it's radio, whether it's cable news, any of these things. So they're all having to I think Joe and I before we started this, we were just discussing how I guess CBS, again, now owned by Paramount, now owned by this David Ellison dude. Um, they just laid off I don't know, several dozen people.
6% of staff. CBS News to lay off 6% of staff, shut down CBS News radio service. That comes out to be about 60 to 70 people. And Barry Weiss, now editor of CBS News. If you follow media, you'll know founder of the Free Press, a Substack publication that is sort of contrarian, I guess, to put it politely. And
Yeah, yeah.
she basically said in so many words that, and the executives there, that, the business is changing and we got to get younger. And this is a part of that shift, which maybe.
Yeah, okay. I mean, maybe. I mean,
Yeah.
sort of, we obviously respond to those same things. Heavy news consumers tend to be older people, not older in the sense of like 70 and 80, although maybe, but in the same way that it has consistently been the case over many, many, many years that voting tends to be people who were a little older. It's a more settled thing, right? You kind of you're kind of going from job to job when you're in your late teens or early 20s. Then you sort of you partner with someone, you have kids, and it's a little more settled. News is sort of like that, and we are obviously very sensitive to, very aware of, and very focused on trying to bring in new people. And kind of like any any kind of business, you want to bring them in relatively young because you want to have them for a while, right? Just some of this is just actuarial. Uh, but what the key is that we are in this period of immense tumult in the business side of the news business. And every time there's like a big layoff or something like that, it's very natural to like, oh, the bosses, they're terrible, and the people who are losing their jobs, and that's all true. But big picture, this is happening because the underlying business fundamentals of the whole news business is very, very shaky. So there is a reality there, but all of that tumult is happening at a moment when you've got these sort of oligarch types basically buying the news business for political reasons. No one would buy it. Believe me, no one would buy it for any other reason. That so this tumult is happening in a period when autocracy and oligarchy are really ascendant in the United States. And that shapes the nature of the transformation. And there's other things that are going on too that are good news, but that is the sort of the big thing with what we have known to date as, mainstream media and where all those companies are going.
Another news item that came out this week, I'm not sure if you saw it, Josh. We haven't discussed it, you and I, but that essentially Jonah Peretti said Buzzfeed as a business the as a business concern into the future is not viable.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring up BuzzFeed is not just BuzzFeed. You should keep that in mind. They own the Huffington Post and other
Yeah.
things. And the reason I bring up BuzzFeed and why I think it relates to what you just said is I remember you and I having conversations back sort of in the heyday of
Yeah.
BuzzFeed News about
Yeah.
how when you look at some of these companies and why would BuzzFeed, which was successful doing viral stuff on its own, why would they have a news division? Because you and I and people in the business know that they're not gonna make money off that, and we talked about at the time, it's a prestige play, right? If you have a news organization, that is a prestige play. It does open you up to different kinds of revenue, but that that play is gonna be one of the first things to go when the rubber hits the road, and I think that's we see that it just drives home your point that at these corporations, if your main business is not journalism, is not producing the news, and you have a shareholder responsibility and you have a board that you have to answer to, at some point, they're gonna come to you and say, like, "Well, hey, why are we doing this?" And
Mhm.
we start to see that at different places as they realize there's other ways to make money, and they can use their distribution mechanisms, whether that's, cable networks, whether that's the internet, to just make money in other ways, and I think that just
Yeah.
underscores your point.
Yeah, yeah, and BuzzFeed is it's funny because when you've been doing this for a long time, you you remember a lot of things, and I remember, I guess it was in 2011, when BuzzFeed had been around for maybe 2 or 3 years at that point, but up until then, it had been literally just like cat videos. Cat videos and listicles and jokes and stuff like this. And just for a little background for everybody, Peretti, he, I think when he got out of when he got out of college, he was up at, I think, the MIT Media Lab, and he was involved in some early study. And I mean study, like, actually, you have these little centers and they study things in emerging media. And he was involved very hands-on in sort of original um, studying of what we now call virality, how that works. Like the actual, when you crunch numbers and you got graphs and some fairly sophisticated analysis of what is this emerging thing. And he was then either grabbed up or went to Huffington. And Huffington early, they were both founded by the same
It
sort of
was
overlapping group.
Lair Ventures,
Yeah,
right?
Lair,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And Lair himself,
Mhm.
I believe, is Kenny Lair. In any case, they got Jonah in at Huffington, and Jonah really understood how this stuff worked, and he was a big part of the original success of Huffington Post. Then he left to do BuzzFeed, which was in a sense sort of like, we understand this virality thing. Why why are we sort of reverse engineering it to make the to make stories at Huffington work? Let's just go purely to kind of like funny cat videos and go whole hog. So at that point, it had been fabulously successful. For those of you who remember this period, sort of the, basically second Obama administration, fabulously successful. And but they eventually faced what Joe was talking to, which is to say, you've got all this traffic, you want to sell it as page views to advertisers, right? Okay. But if you want the prestige advertisers, they don't want to be next to a cat video. They want to be, or they don't want to sponsor your, like, you know,
Like 10
top,
reasons how you could tell someone is Italian. They wear a hat like this and you dress like an
or,
Italian.
10 embarrassing thing,
Yeah,
whatever. They don't
yeah.
want to be, that's weird. That's weird. No one wants to be next to that. And, or at least they don't want to say, if you are, Lexus, you don't want to be like, Lexus brings you, what was that guy, Grumpy Cat? Right? Like,
Yeah,
no one
yeah,
no
yeah,
one wants that. So
yeah.
so basically, they realized is, we need to get some news stuff. We're printing money here, or at least we're printing traffic. What we need to do is have a kind of a front end of serious news stuff, because people want to sponsor that, right? Okay. So they did that, and they spent a ton of money, and they hired a lot of journalists, and a lot of good journalism was done in a certain period at Buzzfeed. They had
Yeah.
tons of very high-end people. A lot of that was they wanted to win some awards. Again, that plays into the prestige and all that kind of stuff. And I think I remember when they hired their I think their first three news people. And I remember people on staff were like, "Oh, BuzzFeed, they're going to interview Grumpy Cat or whatever." But we sort of knew what was happening there. So that in any case, uh, a lot of things happen with BuzzFeed, and it's a complicated story. But the big picture is that eventually the social networks, which were what virality was all about, decided they wanted to bring the virality in house. And relatedly, digital advertising took a big hit. Okay, and those two things put put BuzzFeed on the path to where it is now. And they had all these things, or they had, I don't know what happened to it exactly, but they were going to be making videos in Hollywood and all these kind of things, or making movies, or I don't know what happened to that. But in any case, that's the sort of the trajectory of BuzzFeed, and they had so much money that they've been able to hold on a very long time. But it comes they're getting hit now with with the tail end of what destroyed so many publications in the 3 or 4 years before the pandemic. And just, to bring this back to, I said before, there's some good news things happening in in uh, in the news world, and that's really the maturity and someone is wait, let me see, programmatic. Didn't do programmatic. I'm looking at one of the comments. It's from someone named
Yeah.
TPM. So is that you?
I didn't write it. It must be
Oh,
Derek.
yeah, it's probably Derek. Um, yeah, no, there's Derek is making a point. I'm speaking big brush. But it's still the same, the same issue with digital advertising in general. In any case, you have a new crop of publications that are basically opting out of a large amount of the venture capital world, which in general was terrible for the news business, and also to a great extent the advertising world, which is which I mean, when we were originally basically 100% advertising driven. It was great. We made good money. Everybody was happy until it died, right? So more power to anybody who can do that. But anyway, it's based on subscriptions, and it's based on the publications having a reliance not on the vicissitudes of a big corporation, but on subscribers who actually want the news. And one of the reasons that TPM still exists is that for a number of reasons, we are very early on this. We started with a subscription program back at the end of 2012, and we started growing it as a sort of like a a core, business objective in like 2014. So we were kind of ahead of the game when everything started to come apart. And that's obviously, when we do our sign up drives, our membership drives, that's what that's about. It's so important. I think over 90% of our revenue comes from our readers, subscription fees. So it's huge, but we are not the only ones doing that. There are, most of certainly a lot of publications figured out what was happening in like 2017, 2018, and then tried to stand up like a subscription business like on the fly, like instantly, and those places like almost all went under. But now you have, to a certain extent, sort of kind of made possible by Substack, that they've got a kind of a turnkey kind of setup for it. But you have places like the Bulwark, you have Bolts Mag, You have 404 Media. A number of places that are
Effector.
a defector as a kind of coming out of a slightly different
Mhm.
origin story, but the same basic thing where your reliance is on the people you're producing the news for. So we have all these things happening in the news world right now, and most of them are bad, but not all of them. You do have independent media organizations that have a pretty viable a pretty viable business model if they can make a case to readers. And just one point before I turn it back to Joe, this will sound very funny to a lot of people, and it is kind of funny, but there is a sense, and it's an important sense, in which in this era, the New York Times is actually an independent media organization. In a sense, that sounds absurd. It must have the biggest newsroom in the United States by a lot. Like, 30 years ago, the New York Times was the biggest paper, had the most prestige journalists and stuff. The New York Times, I think now also in absolute terms, but certainly in relative terms, is far bigger than it was in 1990
Mm.
or 1960 or 2000 or 2010, right? Because in those days, they've got their Washington bureau, but so did the Plain Dealer,
Yeah.
so the Blade, so did the LA Times and the Providence Journal Bulletin. Everybody. Now none of those exist. So the time, so they are much
Mhm.
bigger than. But here's the thing: the people who own the Times, technically it's a public company, but it's controlled by a family. The people who own the Times, they basically just do the Times.
Yeah.
They're
Right.
not doing other things, and they're actually less diversified than they were because what they used to own the Boston Globe, they owned a string of local papers. Um, they've gotten rid of most of that stuff. It's just the Times, and you see now and again when Trump says, "Oh, I'm going to sue the Times. I'm going to take them down. They're going to bow down to me." And I constantly see people saying, "Oh, wow, it's going to be like ABC News, right? It's going to be like when the thing with CBS News and when they sued over editing the
Mhm.
60 Minutes
Right,
segment
right.
or something like that." And I always say, like, "No, they're not. No, they're not. It's not because they're great, because Trump can't do anything to them. There's no
Mhm.
merger they need approval on. There's
Yeah.
no O&Os. This is TV networks always want to have a certain percentage of the local stations that they own.
Oh, no,
And you
owned
always
and operated for
yes,
those
yes,
playing at
yes.
home.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is he doesn't have any leverage. So when he sues them, they're like, "Yeah, dude, fuck you. Like,
Mhm.
actually, fuck you, because we don't care. Because, yeah, we're just gonna go to trial, and you're gonna lose, and you're gonna look stupid. And, yeah, maybe you're gonna try to make us burn through some lawyer expenses, but we got plenty of lawyers. We got plenty of money." So it's a paradoxical thing, but at least the principle of the importance of independent news organizations kind of does apply to them, because you need, especially, it didn't under like Dwight Eisenhower or like Jerry Ford, it kind of didn't matter that much, right? That like, oh, you need to not be have to kind of bow down to the president. Well, we weren't playing that way then. Now we are. So
Yeah.
you have to have independent news organizations to, in that sense, to have a real media, not just whatever Barry Weiss is coming up with on a given.
There's a lot there, to touch on. I feel like we could do, like, 4 hours on this. One thing I wanted to close the loop on BuzzFeed, you mentioned, like, they had that short-lived, or maybe not short-lived, but they had the BuzzFeed video department for a while, and
Yeah.
one of the people that come out of that was Quinta Brunson, who
Mm.
went on to found, what is it? The TV show on NBC. Jesus. Um, this is how live TV works, folks.
Yeah, glad you're looking it up because I have no idea what you're talking
Abbott
about.
Elementary. It's awesome.
Oh,
So
okay,
I love
okay.
it. I love
Oh,
it.
I've
I
heard
love
about this.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah, yeah.
great. So wanted to mention that on BuzzFeed. And then I think a lot of what you're talking about with the good news, I think there's one aspect when if you listen to a lot of industry press or you read industry press, like it's very focused on like operationally, hey, this publication is doing this thing, this publication is doing that thing, this place is going out of business, they're trying this new thing. And I think something that is overlooked, maybe because it's just not that interesting, is structure and mission and values of media companies. They really matter, and I think, for example, what you're talking about in terms of your priorities, like if it's journalism, like the New York Times wants to do journalism. Um, a lot of these new independent publications that we're talking about, like Defector and 404 Media, they do journalism. And so if you look at what their values are, they're, well, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but like it's similar to what we have at TPM. Like our about page is intentional in that our primary goal is to do journalism. We want to be a good place to work and we want to make enough money to do all those things. So if you're sketching out a plan for a year and one of your objectives is to be a good place to work, it kind of takes like laying off 25% of the workforce like off the table unless it's like absolutely necessary. But if you're at a place where your number one objective is to be profitable year or to grow because you have to achieve a certain level of profit and a certain level of increased revenue over the previous year, that's an entirely different equation. You might have to lay people off not because you're not profitable or because you're going to go out of business, but because you're not profitable enough. And it ends up where you have a lot of journalism organizations, it's sort of like death by a thousand cuts. You need a certain critical mass to do good work. And that segues into a point someone here, Robert Lurch or Robert Lurchy. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but you ask here, like, can Substack and some of these like journalists, can they scale to do the investigative work of the New York Times? And this is something that, Josh, I'm not sure how much you and I have talked about it, but I've definitely talked about it with my colleague Derek and some other people, that there is something you lack when you're not part of an organization because there are economies of scale, right? Like it's a lot more money if every single journalist at TPM was on their own and they had to figure out insurance, they had to figure out what do I do if someone sues me, like all of these things. But if you're at an organization like TPM, that's those costs can be distributed right throughout the staff. And so I think that's a really good point, and it's one of the reasons we still do need journalism organizations because that does allow you to create these economies of scale where you can do more expensive things, more investigative stuff, send people to different locations. So that's a really important thing. I also wanted to just flag, like I'm in our newsroom right now, and so Josh Kovensky just walked in, and it's a good time for me to plug that our podcast is coming back not next week, but the week after. So TPM Social Club, it's going to be back. Check it out. Yeah, not next week, the week after. It'll probably drop on the Friday. I think that's like April 3rd. And so be on the lookout for that. That's called a plug in the media business. Josh, I wanted to maybe shift a little bit to another problem that is maybe not directly tied to TPM, but it's kind of in our DNA, which is the absolute decimation of local news, which is a problem that's like been going on in the background. I think something like 40% of the country doesn't have any kind of local paper at all. And I mention this because elevating things that are going on at a local level to a national audience so that people know about them has always been core to what TPM is. If those local stations or those local newspapers or those local outlets don't exist, it's hard to elevate these things because they're not doing any reporting. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out how that system affects everyone, right? If there's not as many people doing reporting and all that's left are sort of aggregators and influencers who are in the business of commenting on the work that reporters are doing, those people will be out of a job at some point too. And so, we talk about supporting TPM, supporting independent news, supporting local news is also extremely important, and it's a very difficult that's a very difficult problem, um, and I don't have an answer for it. I know there are some people working on it, like Ken Doctor has been trying to start up some new outlets and it's been promising and had some success. Um, but that's a real tough one, and it goes back to the influence of private equity and rich people just taking over publications and then shutting them down, and it's all tied together.
Yeah, I think, one thing I think about a lot is that, for most of the people talk about the media business and they talk about the journalism business. They're not the same thing, right? And that's not an evaluative thing. They're just not the same thing, right? You have Netflix is in the media business. That's different from running a news organization. Um, News has never been a great business to be in. And for a lot of the 21st century, it's been a really bad business to be in. So one thing that I think is really important to focus on is that you want people, and I think probably applies to the Salzburger family, right? They they obviously are fantastically rich and they own this huge company, but there's obviously a lot of dedication there. They want to, they are as a family unit very invested that they are the New York Times and they have all of the stewardship and power and everything that the sort of the high and low things that goes with that. This is actually why, as much as there are bad things about it, family ownership, and I think a lot of journalists always knew this or certainly know this now. Family ownership of a news organization is on balance a pretty good thing because you have, generally speaking, they're pretty invested in wanting to run a news organization. They need it to make money, but they have some attachment to running a news organization. And just to I get asked a lot, well, how is it that TPM exists after 25 years and when so many other places have gone out of business over that period of time? And there's a lot of technical reasons, and I could go on for a long time about all my smart decisions. Believe me, there were many of them. But the fundamental thing is that everything is different if you really want the news organization to keep running, right? And that's not like it's uh you know uh charity, right? It needs to at least break even. And I want to, I have two kids in college. I'm about to have two kids in college, so like making money is great, but when you really want to have the news organization continue to exist, you start thinking like, okay, how are we going to do this? What are we going to come up with to have this you know keep running? And that gets you thinking a different way than a simple profitability framework. Because frankly, um, it- TPM uh, hasn't made pure economic sense for at least 15 years.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
in the sense of kind of like, should you cash out and just do something different, right, with the money? You could definitely make more money. There's various ways we could make a lot more money now. But again, and this I think it certainly applies to TPM. It applies to a lot of news organizations. If you and you're not going to have a good news organization if you don't have that kind of leadership, where you're not thinking like, is this a good business to be in? But like we really want to be in the news business. We want to be in the news business. So how do we figure out how to do this and pay all of our salaries? Right.
Mhm.
That is a different calculus. There was another point I was going to make here, and I've forgotten it. Maybe you'll say something now, and
I
it'll
thought it
jog my
might
memory.
be I thought it might be good to talk a little bit about, the news business is evolving, it always is. There's more video these days, there's more personal relationships with people, with reporters, I mean, and I think one of the strengths of TPM is correct me if I'm wrong here, but TPM is often, I find one of its strengths is we pick the right time to jump on to a new thing. With programmatic advertising, which is not the sexiest thing, you're like way ahead of everybody else. Like you saw that before everyone else. I think with video, the first pivot to video, which was like it's like a cliche in the news business. The pivot to video, everyone did it, and then everyone sort of you know went out of business that did it.
It
We
destroyed a
never,
lot of
yeah,
companies,
it destroyed companies. Yeah,
it was fundamentally, it was maybe not all of it, but like it was fundamentally driven by fake data that Facebook put out about their video monetization. And
and
that's an important thing to remember.
yeah, and I think one way you could even generalize that is it was driven by the advertisers want telling you like we need you to be on video. I think now we're, several years later and now video is more it's more organic in the sense that the users actually are there. The cost of video production has come down. I mean, this like I have a computer and we can just do this video. I don't need anything else really.
Right,
We don't even
right.
need to edit this when it's over if we don't want to. Um, and so I think now that that's the case, one of the things we're doing at TPM over the next well, forever from here on out is we wanna do more video because we think it is a way to connect with people who prefer video. We think it complements our written journalism, which I think is always gonna be, the core because that's where you can get the depth and everything. Um, that's an example of an evolution at TPM, and I think, one of the reasons we're able to make these pivots is the membership base. It's really, really difficult to say, "Hey, we're gonna start doing new stuff," if you need it to be funded by advertising, right? You have that consistency with the membership base, with the reader revenue, and it's like we can invest in new things, we can try new things, we could test new things and not be worried that like everything is an all or nothing binary move. Um, and so yeah, I just thought I wanted to hear your thoughts on video. We've talked about it a little bit. Obviously, we're doing it, but what do you think?
Well, yeah, we are making a push to do more video, but in a very different, I mean, we never did that earlier thing. We skipped that whole thing, and it that's one of the reasons that we still exist. The difference is basically, as you said, that was an advertiser driven thing. Um, and there were very high CPMs, basically advertising rates for video. But the reality is that most news consumers did not want to look at video. That just wasn't what they wanted to do. And one of the reasons that I knew this is that back in, I guess it was like the 2007, 2008 era. Um, this was when YouTube was picking up steam. It had been acquired by Google. And there were a bunch of startups in the business of basically making original video. Okay. And I knew some people at one of these startups, and I kind of pitched them the idea of we'll do a show every day and it'll be cool. And we have an existing audience, and that's great. And I got them to agree to just a flat contract, right? So kind of, it didn't matter to us. Our revenue was not dependent on on advertising. We were just selling it as we had a contract. We had to deliver a show, and we got paid for it. And that was actually that chunk of money, which I think it was about $15,000 a month. And this is like, again, in 2007 or something like that. And at the time, that was like a third of the revenue of the entire organization. So that was actually, it allowed me to sort of bootstrap like major growth of the whole thing. In any case, it was great for us. It lasted for about 2 years. The company, I don't think they sold more than like one ad against any of our content for the entire 2 years. But they got acquired, I think, by Facebook. So like, no, sorry, Facebook, YouTube. So like everybody's happy,
Yeah,
right?
they're fine. They're fine.
Great
Yeah.
experience for everybody. In any case, but what that taught me is it is really fucking hard to get people to watch video. You had to
Mhm.
sort of force it on them. basically. In any case, now we're obviously in a very different in a very different world. You have a lot of it is a totally different world, and a lot of people like getting some of their news in like what we're doing here. Obviously, podcasting is huge, and the video part of podcasting is becoming huger. There's also just quick updates and stuff like that. So people, that is one of the ways that people consume news. And one of the things that has always been sort of like a doctrine for us is, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves of this, is what I call being format agnostic. And what I mean by that is we never want to be as an organization, sort of like we do this kind of article, the sort of hybrid magazine, newspaper article, that thing. Sometimes it's just a live blog update. Sometimes the news really is one sentence. And if it's one sentence, don't make it an article because that's not necessary. And one of the one of the freedoms that the digital medium gives us is that we have that flexibility. We can um, we can make we can choose the format that goes with the piece of news, and we're, as a lot of places are these days, we do more newsletters than we used to do because that is an emerging way that people now like consuming news, and we want to be there for what the consumption pattern is. And so we're doing more of this. It's really a way to, one of our core things, as with any news organization, we want more people to know about what we do.
Yeah.
We want more people to know about TPM, and so that is part of it. And there are some there are some kinds of news, some snippets of information, some things you can explain where it really is easier to just do 2 minutes of video. Let me just explain it to you. And this is whatever. So we are doing more of that stuff. It's not because we think anybody is going to be advertising against video, or advertising in the video that we are doing. But again, it goes to that issue of being format agnostic and meeting news consumers where the sort of the trends in news consumption are. You can never rest on your laurels in this business because there's so much tumult, there's so much change, often driven by technological change, that you always have to be adapting. So that's why we're kind of making a move into video in a way that that may sound kind of funny because we were so resistant to it a decade ago, but times change, and we're doing it
At
for different reasons.
at the risk of being a little too inside baseball, I wanted to ask you about something that we talk about a lot internally, which is TPM made its TPM's like bread and butter was like, look, there's all these weirdos out there on the fringe. You might not have heard of them, but we have the Jade Helms of the world, right? And then Trump comes along, and these people are not so much on the fringe anymore. They're actually they're actually in the government running things and making
Hmm.
decisions. And so now it's sort of like the things that we're covering, everyone's covering those. And so we kind of have to not adjust, but it's a unique challenge, I think, editorially for how do we continue to cover politics and continue to advance stories when the rest of the world sort of is following us from like a macro perspective. Like we were ahead of this, right? And now you're all catching up to us. And so just like from a journalist, as a journalist, how do you think about that? Because like I work here, but I'm a publisher, so I'm not thinking about like as much as you are, just actually covering the stuff. So how do you think about that dynamic?
Well, at some level, it was sort of a great success for us as an organization because our sort of premise through, um, really through the sort of first 15 years of the site's existence was that these people are not sort of like kind of weirdos on the margin. They're actually what they are central to our politics, and they actually run the Republican Party, even though people don't realize that. And in a very basic way, Trump's rise kind of vindicated that understanding. Because Trump's insight, the in the Obama years, especially in the second Obama administration, the general model was you got someone like a John Boehner or actually,
Any of the
God,
young guns, any of the young guns.
yeah, what is God? I'm spacing on
Eric
the
Cantor, who I'll never
not
forget
Cantor.
him
Who's
getting
wait?
Ryan,
Who?
Paul Ryan.
Yeah, Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan.
Yeah.
Um, you have a sort of a John Boehner or Paul Ryan, pretty conservative, but you know, house trained and can sort of seem fairly normal. And
House train.
that those are the people who that's sort of the face of the Republican Party. That does a certain thing. But in fact, the congressional parties were run by the Freedom Caucus. And there was this sort of which was kind of a proto-Trump, proto-MAGA thing. But there was this sort of tacit arrangement in which you let us run things, and you can be speaker and kind of nominally make the decisions. We can't do it because that would sort of we'd lose our majorities. We need you there to sort of be the the sort of the mascot, or to be the public face of what we do. And Trump's great insight was to say, fuck this. I'm going to actually
Mhm.
run the country directly from the Freedom Caucus. With those guys, I'm going to run with that politics. I'm going to run with that sort of vibe and mood. And for a complicated set of reasons, he was able to do that. And all the sort of the Boehners and Ryans, I don't know what those guys are doing now. I guess they're working for like the pot industry or
I
something.
was gonna say
But
Boehner all of a sudden was like, "Hey man, I love weed. I'm all about weed."
yeah,
It's like, okay, dude. Okay.
right. So it does that. That was our sort of it did create has created sort of editorial challenges for us because we sort of everybody's on those people who you had to kind of come to us to learn about that. And you adapt. You adapt and you find new things that are that are being ignored. And that's one of the exciting things, and also one of the really challenging things about running a small news organization, that you really have to be on your feet and constantly changing things up, and being reactive in an editorial sense. One thing I probably told you this, Joe, when you started here, and Joe's been with TPM for I think more than a dozen years now, a little more than a dozen years.
Yeah, since
Um,
2013. So,
yeah,
yeah.
um, that when you are when you're a big news organization, and this is why a lot of news organizations went under. When you're a big news organization, you can fool yourself into thinking that you can buck the trends, that the trends won't affect you, that you're big enough that you will make do. When you're small, you're never under that illusion. You know that the new trend will affect you first and probably destroy you, if you don't have some way to deal with it. And that can be a benefit in a way because the trends come for everybody. Just some people realize it before others do, and you're sort of like people who run small news organizations have to be sort of like, I don't know, one of these like tiny like primates or like prosimians, like, lemurs and stuff, these very small kind of primate or
Yeah.
primate like things that are very kind of nervous and constantly looking everywhere because they're so endangered, right?
Mhm.
That's how a small news organization runs. So, yeah, you always have to be coming up with the new thing, and that's there's a process of constant reinvention that you have to do, and you have to have your eyes open.
I feel like there's something else too, which is that even though people are writing about them, they don't get them. There's a difference between, like, covering someone and understanding your subject,
Hmm.
and I think that's probably, like, one of the number one gripes people have at the Times, for example, is they cover right, like, it became a meme, like, "Is this the day that Trump became the president?" Like, he's serious now, and we heard about that, like, every day for 4 or 5 years. And then, we don't hear that as much now, but we still hear, like, his ideas taken credulously when they're ridiculous. I think and you and I have talked about, how, I talked about this with my buddy Derek or colleague Derek and buddy Derek, about how Wall Street now seems to be the people that don't really get him.
Yeah,
They take this stuff seriously. They don't realize, like, this is kind of a different kinda cat, maybe now they're starting to understand with the
it,
taco stuff.
it's funny that I actually have a post that I'm working on that I set aside so we could do this video, um, basically on that point because there's been this. I think a lot of people have noticed this now that there's obviously been a lot of market tumult and the futures, the futures for a barrel of oil have at least flirted with being double the cost that they were. It was in the 60s and it's at least hit 120 a couple times.
Yeah.
Obviously there's different benchmarks and stuff. So but you can't say nothing has happened, but I think a lot of people have sort of focused on like the markets still seem to be kind of underestimating the the potential, where this could be going. Not just things with like uh, possible oil scarcity, let alone price run ups, but just the way that uh, the macroeconomy is not nearly as dependent and sensitive to the price of oil as it was in the 70s, which is basically the oil crises were kind of what created inflation in the
Mhm.
70s. More complicated than that, but that was a big part of it. The price input on manufacturing of the barrel of oil was really high. It's not nearly as high, but it's still a really fucking big deal,
Mhm.
right? Even the most basic point of like people need to drive the food around the country, right? Even stuff in the United States, you need to get it places, and so it does seem like, and I've wondered, like, is this because you know commodities traders, you probably can't find a Trumpier demographic, right? The sort of
Yeah.
just the personality type of people in that space. So is it that? Is it what is it? And there was a piece, and I think in the Journal last night or yesterday, that was basically that everybody's freaking out because they can't figure out where to get information from about how to price risk about the oil markets. And they're saying, some guys are like they're hiring, like, they're like thumbing through like the sort of people who've left the DOD and the State Department. Like, who the fucking can tell me what's happening here? And but there was another thing, and actually someone told me something yesterday that one of the one of the investment advisory departments of one of the big banks, okay, did a
Are we breaking
was it
news here? You breaking news?
no, we're not. I have to
Okay.
keep it vague. I'll mention it
Okay.
it's mentioned in the post too. But the point is that these places have, they have the advisories that sort of shows up everywhere. Then they have the stuff for the big players, right? What
Mhm.
we think's happening. And I sort of caught wind that one of these had one of those. And it was yesterday, and it's like, hey, things are about to get good because Trump's got this new angle, and he's gonna take care of it. And I got a kind of a loose description of what the plan was, and it was just really stupid. It made no sense at all. But they were kind of running with it. And I noticed last night there was, I think it was an Axios. They had a they had a one of these items, and the items was that everybody on the street just hoping for the best. I think they called it like hope, kind of smoking hopium or something like
Yeah.
and they said in the beginning of this, and this is Axios. This is Axios. This is not where you expect to hear stuff like this. Um, but the first line of it was something like, you see this pattern now where each morning oil's up, the markets are, the equities markets are down. And then like around 1 p.m., Trump will say something like, yeah, I got a new plan. We're going to open this thing back up and it's going to be awesome. And then the markets just go in the opposite direction. Right. And and I think some of this is because they're just pretty Trumpy, A. And to take this back to what you're talking about with the Times, how they interpret these people, there is this great need that the sort of the information and economic system in this world, especially in the United States, has. They need Trump to operate in normal bounds. They need him to be normal in some way and predictable, and do things in some sort of way that, again, that follows certain predictable things, right? So some of that is too, like, he said it. He wouldn't have
Right.
said it if he weren't going to do it, you know. Um, Whereas, sort of like, if you've been in this Trump world for a long time, you're like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about? He's constantly saying bullshit, and just and it means it it doesn't mean anything. It could, the fact that he says something, I'm not sure it means the thing is less like, it just means nothing, right? And so I some of this is that we know Wall Street is pretty Trumpy, and some of this, you always think or want to think, well, they're Trumpy, but they also want to make money, and so they're not going to be making wishful thinking bets. But you don't know when your thinking is wishful, right? That's why wishful thinking is dangerous. But the other thing that occurred to me, and this is kind of, this is going to be in that post, is that uh, probably more than market orthodoxy wants to admit, that the markets will look to the sort of the United States government for at least like a broad directional sense of what the fuck is happening. Truth is the first casualty of war. We know that. For those of us, even relatively young people, you remember back to the second Bush administration, where all of this, like, oh, we're getting this insurgency under control. It's getting better. It's blah blah, all this kind of stuff. But still, a basic sense of sort of like when the White House says, okay, we're going to start doing a convoy here. We're gonna protect these ships. We're gonna push through. It's gonna be okay. I think it's very hard for the markets. It's hard for everybody to think like, okay, maybe that's just not true at all.
Yeah.
Maybe just Trump's getting nervous, and this is what he came up with today. And um, yeah, there, so you have all of these sort of, kind of transformational things in the world happening, that is, playing into this level of wishful thinking. And it's it's weird. I would say one last thing on this, that a couple weeks ago I wrote a brief piece about this guy. Can't remember his name, but he's got a YouTube channel, and he's like a professor of like maritime studies. I think someplace down south. I think he consults, but basically it's called like "What's Up with Shipping?" Kind of hardcore nerd stuff, except for now, right? Kind of like container ships. What's the latest with container ships? Where are they moving? Where are they not moving? This kind of stuff. But it's fascinating. This is obviously how the world actually runs, right? And so I was watching some of his. Wait, hold on. I don't know if you can still see me. Something just happened.
I can see you.
One
You're
second.
here.
Okay,
Did you just,
yeah.
like, knock your camera over?
No, but here, hold on one second.
Live TV, folks.
Uh, yeah, I
This is
know.
good
All right,
stuff.
we're back. Okay. No, I moved something on the mic here, and the screen went blank.
Mm.
So I thought something. In any case, so this is early on, and Trump has already started. This is a couple weeks ago. Um, uh, Trump is already saying, "All right, we're gonna get the Navy to escort these ships through. We got it, right?" And I watched one of this guy's show, and he said the U.S. Navy has no ships in the Persian Gulf right now, and actually none of the ships that would do this kind of thing, like frigates and like destroyers and stuff, they're not even close. And I was struck by. I remember thinking like, I don't know this. I'm not keeping track of where these carrier groups are, and
Oh, you're not?
the reason. What's that?
No, I'm joking. Like
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where they are, and frankly, it makes sense they're not there because the Navy's really nervous about its ships getting hit by stuff.
Yeah.
And when you're doing all this stuff, you don't want them. Those are very confined spaces, right? These are these certainly for a carrier group, but even like these smaller, ships, like again, destroyers and frigates and
Yeah.
stuff. Strait of Hormuz is very tight. These
Yeah.
ships are, yes, they do littoral stuff. They do, but these ships are really where they want to be is out at sea. They don't want to be right up against the land. That's dangerous, right? Okay. But I was struck, like, how are big news organizations talking about this convoy they're about to do, and like someone there should be paying attention. Well, do you have any ships there? Like, no. So what the fuck are you talking about? And that I think is what you see some version of that um, in the markets, because clearly, remember there was that one day where there was the initial run up in the price of oil, and then he came out and he said, "Yeah, we're gonna do these convoys. It's gonna be awesome." And then it fell back down to like I think it may have gone below 80.
It did.
Went
I know
back in,
exactly what you're talking about.
yeah,
People are
went
like, "Ah,
went back.
okay, okay,
Yeah,
we
all
have an
right, we're gonna get
escort now."
serious about this,
Yeah.
right? And there was actually, I think it was the energy secretary went on Twitter. He's like, "Yeah, we just escorted the first one. It went great." And it turned out that was, I mean, even for them, it was weird because he just, I don't know, he heard that on some Discord channel or something. He just
Yeah.
went out and said it. But anyway, all of this is a way of saying that we are in a very weird world, and you need good news organizations, and we're one of them. So you should support our work, and frankly you should support a lot of the other ones too, because there's
Yeah.
a lot of these independent outfits that are really making a go of it, and that is a different kind of proposition when you are when you're doing it with readers, because I remember uh, uh, once we were sort of pretty far into this would be like, a couple years before the pandemic, maybe 2016, 2017, when we knew that we needed to get to fully funding our operation with subscriptions. And what I would say to the team is, in the ad world, the advertisers don't give a crap about us,
Yeah.
which is what you want, frankly. You don't want them to be like, kind of attached to you as a news organization. But those things about the platform economy and all those things, those are things we have no control over whatsoever. But this, we should be pretty well positioned to make a really good TPM,
Yeah.
right? So our fate is really in our hands, to as much as it kind of ever can be, that it's a matter of, do readers value what we are doing? And that's up to us. And if we
Yeah.
can't, then it's on us. So that is, that's another thing about the sort of the underlying culture of subscription driven, subscription funded publications, is the core relationship is with the readers. And that makes everything, that gives it gives an integrity and a stability that doesn't exist in those other kind of economics of publishing.
An anecdote to take the readers behind the scenes a little bit. I know Josh is here trying to pretend like he's not like a naval watcher, but there is one day years ago we get books a lot in the office. Like people send us proofs of books, and he walks over to me and he hands me this book about like the strategy of the ships, like the strategy of moving aircraft carriers around in maritime zones. And you said to me, if you wanna understand strategy, to study the movement of ships. And I think I had been working here for like a year at this point, and I was like, "All right, man, we're operating at a whole different level at this place." Like, there was no lessons like this at Bloomberg when I was at Bloomberg, and that's one of
Well,
those things I never forgot.
well, navies run the world. They,
Yeah.
they really do, and it's a fascinating, it's a fascinating topic, and it's that's a whole other topic we can get into. I can't remember the guy's name. I'm sure one of the people listening is gonna know. Wait, what is? There's a guy. There was a U.S. Navy captain, not an admiral, kind of mid-level guy, but he wrote this book around the turn of the 20th century. And the title of the book is something like "The Role of Naval Power in History." And he basically goes back to Carthage and all this kind of,
Hell yeah.
and all these things, and basically saying that great powers have great navies. This is how it works. This is how the world is controlled. And God, I'm spacing on his name. In any case, Teddy Roosevelt kind of got
Yeah, it wasn't like he
was
wrote one of the first. We're getting way
well,
off
he
topic here, but
yeah,
yeah.
he
That was still
I think
studied
wait,
until quite recently.
yeah, Mahan, I think is his name. Mahan is the guy who wrote the book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Krobama
Mahan.
gotcha, he said Mahan, yeah.
Yeah. In any case, uh that was sort of like the origins of yeah, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Um Basically drove um America's big push into naval power.
So
I don't know how we were on this, but yes, I've always been
yeah,
interested in naval
weird.
power and
Um,
capital
so
ships and all that stuff.
I think we can't have a business talk. We've been going for over an hour here. I want to probably should wrap up soon, but we can't talk about like the state of the media and the state of the news without um, discussing AI a bit, because it's fundamentally reshaping the news business. It's fundamentally reshaping a lot of industries right now, and we don't know the end game. I put my cards on the table. I don't really understand how this stuff all shakes out in the end when the energy costs are so high. I'm not sure most of the use cases are really, the general the public is into them. But it seems like when you look at development and, AI as a tool with coding and maybe replacing some road activities, it is a it's it's um it's here to stay in certain respects. So I think it's interesting to talk about sort of what we've seen AI in the industry, what it's doing, and kind of like our thoughts on it. Because I think people over time are going to want to know from where they're getting their news, like how are you using AI? And I think we've talked about like it can be a tool. However, we're very focused on having real relationships with our readers and them knowing that the people ultimately who are putting the reporting out there, who are doing the editing, that's all human based. And I think that's going to be a differentiator into the future. You're going to separate AI news from human news. Um, we want to be on the human news side. But I'm curious your thoughts and how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I think I see it in similar terms. I think it's a great unknown today what what is realistic prediction and what is hype about AI. I think I personally and organizationally, I would say I'm a skeptic, not an opponent, but a skeptic. I'm generally just skeptical of a lot of the claims. I think we what we've seen is that it's not random what it's good at. AI, even in its current form, is really good at tasks that are in very bounded spaces, and that is one of the reasons that coding is it's so good at that, because coding is a very bounded space, right? There's certain ways you do things. You can do them more efficiently, but it's an internal language. So that makes sense. And we have even seen we are making use of it in our coding. We have a small development team, two people, and we hear from them how much AI, these bots and assistants and stuff, are allowing them to basically produce code much faster than they were in the past. So we are making it we are making use of it in that way, and we are open to making use of it in various ways that we can do more with less. We are not interested in having it replace our reporters. Period. End of story. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is simply that it is one of those things that I think we've seen that AI does not do well, right? And it always I'm always very struck by how they say this. They're like, it's great, except for the 20% of the time it makes stuff up. Well,
Yeah.
that's not great. It's it's sort of like I've got a totally you know, I've got a totally sterile syringes in our Quest lab, except for the 27%, 20% of the time that we get hepatitis or HIV on the needles. Beside that, it's great. Well, okay, the story, it's over then. In any case, yeah, we are not we're not against AI. We're looking for ways to use it to sort of do more, but do more in ways that are not compromising what we're about, which is having smart people dig into topics and put that information in front of our readers. And that's sort of doctrinal, and that's never going to change. Just to give you an example, like one thing and Joe will know more about this specifically because this is something that we're kind of working on, and I only know in outlines, but coming up with ways that we can uh, go out and be looking at more things that are happening, right? Like, think of all the people producing podcasts and all the different news sources, and we want to know when a certain topic is discussed. And so we can develop AI bots that can sort of do that for us at scale. Tell us it got talked about on this podcast. So okay, let's go look at that. I mean, Joe, you can
Yeah,
more
I mean,
about
a
what
lot
that's
of that's
about.
still yeah, it's still, like, developmental, but I think the
Yeah,
key there is it's things that I don't know, it's important to remember that AI is a marketing term, and a lot of what we you call AI, like, if you have a s if you 3 or 4 years ago, you had software that does translation that does, transcription, right? You could put a audio in to something and it would transcribe it, and they would've just said that's a transcription software. Now it's AI, right? Um, and I think what that's first of all, that's really important not to, like, kind of get caught up in that, in the marketing of it. And I think with the tools you're describing, it's really just it's just things where it's things that there's a lot of times there's already technology that exists to do this. It just does it better or
yeah,
faster.
yeah,
And I think that's like a key distinction, right? I think, we could do a whole episode on AI and all these other things, like, and in terms of like global, how it fits into society and why like, I don't love AI. I'd prefer that it didn't exist. That would be my preference because
Yeah.
but not because AI is, like, bad in a vacuum, it's because of the society we live in. You know how AI gets used. You
Yeah.
tools adhere and technology adhere to the society, and if the prevailing, uh, priorities are to make money, it's gonna be used to make money, and it goes back to all the things we talked about earlier. If you're a business and you wanna increase your profit, that's your main goal, that's all you care about, it ends up in cost reduction. Then you potentially have a far worse product. Everyone's pissed at you because your product is shitty now. So there's all these like knock-on effects I think that we're gonna see. And um there's just a lot to shake out. And it's hard to not see it as also sort of just silly and ridiculous when I saw one estimate that like if to really realize what Sam Altman is talking about, some of these other people, that it would require energy source, like, larger than the sun. Like, it literally can't exist. It doesn't
Mhm.
exist. You would need
Right.
and so my thing is, like, is this like another bubble, really? Right? Like, is this 2008? Um, that's a whole 'nother call. That's a whole 'nother call.
Yeah, I think, uh, one part of this is that I when I have these conversations with people, I try to pull it back to machine learning. Uh, that is a phrase and a concept and something that has a history, and that's what we're talking about. And as you say, AI is really is really marketing language. And there are certain things that are being done now that you might say, okay, artificial intelligence is a better way to describe maybe than machine learning because it's kind of operating at some level, whatever. But a lot of it is just machine learning. And it does certain things really well, and other things it doesn't do well. And yeah, and to your other point about political economy, this is the sort of the fundamental thing to me is that the technology is one thing, but largely the technology now is controlled by like the top oligarchs and oligarchs who've made common cause with the sort of global authoritarian movement. And that is a big, big deal because that means that how AI is being implemented, it's going to be implemented on their terms. And that is, that is almost a good reason to resist it at every stage because they're making the rules and their values or lack of values are being embedded into the into the rollout. Um, so it's complicated, and I think in general uh, we're trying not to. We are looking for ways that we can do secondary things more efficiently. Give our reporters tools that they can find things more easily. Um, but we're never going to be an organization that is using AI to communicate with you. Just
Um,
fundamental.
Alright, we've been doing this for about an hour and 20, so I think maybe time to wrap it up. Before we go, I just wanted to thank everybody, for
Yeah.
being here, for joining. If you primarily interact with TPM via Substack, via the Morning Memo, know that we have an entire website and organization. So check out talkingpointsmemo.com. Uh, you could find, the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga on Spotify, on iTunes, wherever you get podcasts, on YouTube, although we will be launching a new YouTube channel soon, so be on the lookout for that. If you live in Austin, Texas, we're coming to Austin, Texas. If you haven't seen the tickets are on sale, um, they are. So check that out. If you get confused, you don't know where they are, you could always email me, joe at talkingpointsmemo.com. You can email me not about anything, but most things, and I will respond. Be on the lookout for Josh and I's podcast coming back in 2 weeks. Check out all of our newsletters, Where Things Stand, Morning Memo, the Back Channel, which is the big guy here, his newsletter. Um, I think that's everything. What do you any closing thoughts? Oh, if you're not a member, what are you doing? Be a member. We're in the middle of our membership drive. 25% off. Unless you're in the chat, I saw someone dropped in a 40% off. So sneaky. whoever did that, but take advantage of it. We're trying to get to 1,000 new members. If you're a member, maybe just tell your friends to sign up. That'd be good. If all of our members told one friend to become a member, we would have 70,000 members overnight. So think about that. One person, that's all it takes.
Cool. All right. I guess that's it. All right. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys and
Later, folks.
ladies, everyone. Take it easy.